Welcome to Revelation Unraveled. I'm your host, William Tapley, also known as the third eagle of the apocalypse and the co-prophet of these end times. Today I have bad news and bad news. And both of the bad news comes from our false prophet of the end times, and that is Pope Francis. Because now he is going to allow fornicators to receive Holy Communion. And I read this article just this past week from LifeSite News, and here's the headline. Diocese of Rome's new guidelines allow communion for sexually active cohabitating couples in limited cases. Now, that goes against entirely what Jesus said. He said, no fornicator will ever enter the kingdom of heaven. But, of course, the false prophet will undermine the words of Jesus every chance he gets. And so let me read this part of this article from you, and I'll put the link to it below. And the date line is October 5th. That's this past Wednesday, I believe. LifeSite News, and the author is Claire Chrétien, and she writes a lot of excellent articles on Pope Francis' apostolic exhortation, Amoris Laetitia, which undermines, which perverts church teaching and Bible teaching. And here's what she writes. New guidelines about the interpretation of Amoris Laetitia, issued for the Pope's own diocese of Rome, suggests that couples living in a state the Church labels objectively sinful, that is, mortal sin, may in limited circumstances receive Holy Communion in a discreet manner. And discreet manner is in quotation marks. The release of the new guidelines follows closely on the Vatican's authentication of a letter from Pope Francis to Argentine bishops affirming that the only valid interpretation of the exhortation is one that similarly liberalizes sacramental practice. I disagree with her choice of words liberalize. A better choice would be perverts sacramental practice. The vicar of the Diocese of Rome, now listen to this, here's where Pope Francis likes to delegate the dirty work to somebody else. Cardinal Agostino Vellini publicized the official diocesan guidelines for the implementation of Amoris Laetitia last month. Pope Francis is the bishop of the Diocese of Rome. Don't forget that. He is the ultimate authority in Rome. That's his own personal diocese. According to veteran Vatican journalist Sandro Magister, it is unthinkable that the Cardinal Vicar made these guidelines official without the supreme proprietor of the diocese having first read and approved them. But of course, he likes to keep his hand behind it secret. He likes to let the Cardinal take the heat. The fact is, Pope Francis is all in favor of not only divorced and civilly remarried Catholics receiving communion, but also those living together, shacking up those who are in fornication. As Jesus said, let me repeat, no fornicator will ever enter the kingdom of heaven. And this article continues. The Diocese of Rome's guidelines suggest that unmarried couples living together and engaging in a sexual relationship may receive the sacraments without repenting if continence makes the stability, again in quotation marks, of their relationship difficult. Jesus did not say no fornicator will enter the kingdom of heaven unless it makes their stability of their relationship difficult. Jesus did not add those exceptions. Only the false prophet is adding those exceptions. And after a period of discernment with their confessor, such couples only may be admitted to the sacraments if there is the moral certainty that the first marriage of one of the two parties was null. And it doesn't have to be an annulled marriage or a marriage at all. It could be these are two people who are cohabitating. But there are not enough proofs to demonstrate this in a judicial setting. In other words, priests are going to be allowed to give annulments in the so-called internal forum. However, they may not receive the sacraments if their sinful relationship is shown off as if it were part of the Christian ideal according to the guidelines. Well, this is all gobbledygook. I mean, maybe if you live in a big city, you can be cohabitating, and unless you carry a sign down to communion, which says, I'm shacking up with my girlfriend, nobody's going to know it. But that's not true in a small town. I live in a small town, and you're not going to cohabit with your girlfriend without everybody knowing it. Believe me. And this article continues. The guidelines also state that the decision to permit a couple to the sacraments should be taken by a confessor in the context of the internal form. This is nonsense. Through discussions with the couple's confessors, over time, it is possible to begin and develop with him an itinerary of long, patient conversion. Supposedly over time, you can overturn what Jesus said. Made of small steps and of progressive verifications. Read the guidelines. More gobbledygook. So it can be none other than the confessor at a certain point in his conscience, after much reflection and prayer. Well, how much? How much reflection and prayer? What does he got to do? Pray for a week, a month, a year? The guidelines don't say anything about that. They want to change the gospel, and no matter how long it takes, Pope Francis will succeed. Who must assume the responsibility before God and the penitent and ask that the access take place in a discreet manner. What a joke. Now here's what Pope John Paul II wrote. His guidelines are true and accurate and faithful to the words of Jesus in the gospel. The Church reaffirms her practice, which is based upon sacred scripture, of not admitting to Eucharistic communion divorced persons who have remarried, and I might add, certainly not people living in fornication. They are unable to be admitted thereto from the fact that their state and condition of life objectively contradict that union of love between Christ and the Church, which is signified and affected by the Eucharist. Beside this, there is another special pastoral reason. If these people were admitted to the Eucharist, the faithful would be led into error and confusion regarding the Church's teaching about the indissolubility of marriage. And Pope John Paul II, who is now a saint, continues, and this is from his encyclical Familiaris Consortio: reconciliation in the sacrament of penance, which would open the way to the Eucharist, can only be granted to those who, repenting of having broken the sign of the covenant and of fidelity to Christ, are sincerely ready to undertake a way of life that no longer is in contradiction to the indissolubility of marriage. That means, in practice, that when for serious reasons, such as, for example, the children's upbringing, a man and a woman cannot satisfy the obligation to separate, they take on themselves the duty to live in complete continence, that is, abstinence from the acts proper to married couples. And what is the second bad news? The second bad news is that by the Pope, that is the Bishop of Rome, allowing communion to people living in mortal sin means that the Eucharist that all priests consecrate in the city of Rome are no longer valid. And I know a lot of people disagree with me on that. You will find out the hard way. People in Chicago, I am sure, are already discovering that their Eucharists are not valid. They feel it in their hearts. And that's because Bishop Supich of Chicago has said anyone and everyone may receive Holy Communion. Well, I hate to tell you, Bishop Supich, but Jesus did not give communion to the traitor Judas. He sent him away from the Lord's table. And you bishops, if you want communion to be valid in your churches, as in Poland, you have to go against what Pope Francis is doing. And I want to read just a little bit from Summa Theologica. This is St. Thomas's epic on the church. He is a doctor of the church. And this is question 64, and it's about the priest's intention. Who determines the priest's intention as far as the validity of the sacrament goes? And this is part of his objection 1, and this is Article 10 of Summa Theologica, and I believe it's question 64. It seems that the validity of a sacrament requires a good intention of the minister, for the minister's intention should be in conformity with the Church's intention. but the intention of the church is always good. Well, see, here is where St. Thomas can't foresee a time in which the church's intention would be perverted and would go evil. What he explains in his answers, in his Summa Theologica, is that it is not the priest's intention that determines the validity of the sacrament, it's the church's intention. And if the church's intention is, as I say, perverted, then the sacrament is not valid. Now he gives an example of where if the minister or the priest's intention is not moral, that does not change the validity of the sacrament. And that's true so long as the church's intention is true. The minister's intention may be perverted as to something that follows the sacrament. For instance, a priest may intend to baptize a woman so as to be able to abuse her, or to consecrate the body of Christ so as to use it for sorcery. And because that which comes first does not depend on that which follows, consequently, such a perverse intention does not annul the sacrament, but the minister himself sins grievously in having such an intention. And of course, that's because the priest's intention is hidden. It is the church's intention which takes precedence. And these are all signs of the end times. It's a sign that the first abomination of desolation has taken place, as prophesied by Daniel in his chapter 10, verse number 3. I ate no desirable bread, and neither flesh nor wine entered into my mouth. Neither was I anointed with oil for the period of 3 weeks. Those 3 weeks symbolize 3 years. I'm not sure when Pope Francis first took the daily sacrifice away from the prince. I predicted it would be during Holy Week of 2014. And sure enough, Pope Francis on Easter Monday of 2014 telephoned that woman in Argentina and said that she could receive communion even though she was divorced and civilly remarried. If the time begins then 3.5 years would be the fall of 2017. Now the period could start later with the publication of Amoris Laetitia. Dates are not so important as knowing that unless your priest or bishop contradicts the Pope and publicly goes against what fake Francis is saying, your communions are invalid because, as I say, the church's intention supersedes the priest's intention. It has always been that way. What's new is that now the church's intention is evil. Pope Francis is turning the one world religion into a Protestant organization, which I have said many times on this program. The Eucharist in Protestant churches are not valid. That is, they are not the real body and the blood of our Christ. And that's because they also allow divorced and remarried and fornicators to receive Holy Communion. Their communions are not valid. And the communions in Pope Francis' church, the one world religion, they are not valid either, unless, as I say, your priest or bishop contradicts the Pope and publicly says, I am not going to give communion to people living in mortal sin. And if you would like more information about my ministry here on YouTube, visit my 30eaglemedia.com website.